extend a warm welcome to each of you to the Positive Psychology Center's colloquium series. And we are very excited to hear today from Stuti Thapa on development and validation of the mechanisms of engagement in the arts and humanities scales. And before I introduce her and turn it over to her, I just want to give a very brief overview of kind of situating this work. As many of you know, the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project started, goodness, 7 years ago now at the Positive Psychology Center. And we are delighted to have Louis Tay with us, who was the founding research director. And Louis and I spent a lot of hours trying to figure out which direction we would want all of this to go. And Louis very wisely suggested to us that we would want to create a conceptual model. And so we developed one and revised it. And part of that conceptual model was to look at the mechanisms that might connect engagement with the arts and humanities and a range of well-being outcomes. And so a number of folks have been working hard on this in the intervening years, and we're delighted to be able to present the model that we have, the toolkit that we have. Of course, all of this, Marty, is built squarely on your shoulders, and so we really appreciate your support. It was very kind of you to have started the field of positive psychology more than 20 years ago, without which this work would not have been able to happen, and then obviously your support at the Positive Psychology Center. We're also really pleased to have Sunil Iyengar with us today. Sunil is the research director at the National Endowment for the Arts and has been a long-term, I don't know if I'm allowed to say collaborator, Sunil, because that may not be, acceptable, but
go for it.
Certainly a collaborator, whether officially or not. And within the last year, I guess officially, because we have been designated, the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project has been designated an NEA research lab. And so it's been great, Sunil, to be able now to work much more closely with you. And we deeply appreciate your support. So we welcome everyone else who is here as well, members of the HHF team and others. And at this point, I would like to introduce our speaker of the hour. So Stuti Thapa is a PhD candidate in the Industrial Organizational Psychology program at Purdue University. Her research interests include well-being, emotion, statistical analyses, and methodology. She has published in outlets such as Annual Review of Organizational Psychology and Organizational Behavior and Organizational Research Methods. So Stuti, thank you so much for the work that you have done spearheading this project. We're really looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you for the introduction, James. I am, again, really excited to present this research and look forward to any thoughts or feedback you have. So let me quickly share my screen. All right. Again, thank you for the invitation. And like James said, this is a work done in collaboration with the HHF group, and it's work developing and validating the RAISE scale, which is sort of the psychological mechanisms of engagement in the arts and humanities. So first, I want to acknowledge my collaborators. Obviously, these are probably familiar faces because they worked on this project for quite a long time. Hoda Wazir, Yurin Jim, and James Pulaski. I don't think this work would have been possible without them. I also want to acknowledge that this research was funded by the Thapa Religion Trust. So I think by the fact that we are all in this room, it is pretty obvious to all of us that arts and humanities take a crucial role in our lives. Children are socialized in our culture through stories, songs, movies, and progress through formal education in literature, music, history, and arts. And then in adulthood, we have people across different diverse backgrounds and cultures find influences of arts and humanities in education, leisure, and work, some through formal education, some just out in the community. right? Um, Now, these effects of involvement in the arts and humanities have been shown in literature as well. Research from varied disciplines suggests that engagement in the arts and humanities can lead to positive well-being outcomes. This can include increase in positive affect, decrease in negative affect, higher psychological well-being, health outcomes, and as well as subjective well-being. And there has been multiple investigations into arts-related interventions leading to improvements across different contexts, like improvements in education, workplace, health-related contexts, and found them to be effective ways of improving human well-being or flourishing. Now, while there's a lot of work suggesting that engagement in the arts and humanities can lead to human flourishing, there's still a need for empirical investigation into how they do so. So what are the cognitive, affective, behavioral, and social processes through which engagement in the arts and humanities can lead to human flourishing? Um, Building on the conceptual model proposed by Tay, Pawlowski, and Keith in 2018, we argue that engagement in the arts and humanities can lead to greater well-being by providing rich, immersive experiences where one can socialize, reflect, and express themselves, and subsequently provide them with skills that then contribute to their flourishing. Specifically, we label them as RAISE mechanisms, reflectiveness, acquisition, immersion, socialization, and expressiveness, based on, again, Tedal's conceptual model. We argue that these are the psychological mechanisms through which engagement in the arts and humanities may affect individual outcomes. So in the next few minutes of the talk, I will detail each of these psychological mechanisms and how engagement in the arts and humanities can have positive effects on well-being through them. So first we have reflectiveness, and this is the intentional cognitive emotional process for developing, reinforcing, or disregarding one's habits, character, values, and worldview. Now, engagement in the arts and humanities can reveal insights into the desirable and undesirable parts of self, right? And motivate one to change oneself, and also sometimes give you the means to do so. So past research has suggested that effectiveness through arts and engagement in arts and humanities can promote critical thinking and perspective taking, help them develop better moral compass, enhance self-growth, enhanced meaning and purpose, and also make them question current practices and triggering civic engagement and social change. Now, reflectiveness can take different forms based on different individual experiences. So it can first be in form of internal reflection about different aspects of their life, right? So it can be sort of like a thinking about like your own behavior, your own motives, your own character, etc., and then can function as an impetus for profound change. So engagement in arts and humanities can lead to this type of reflectiveness and therefore lead to the positive human flourishing outcomes. Similarly, engage in varying sources of arts and humanities, like reading different philosophical books or fictional books or watching theater, can also lead one to reflect on the state of the world and explore philosophical questions about life. And third, one can also reflect on other people's thoughts and perspectives, leading one to see the world and people from a new perspective. So engagement in arts and humanities can then therefore affect individual perspectives and well-being through these three different dimensions. So the next mechanism through which arts and humanities can lead to flourishing is through skill development. So acquisition as an acquisition of skills. So this underlies social cognitive processes that underlie practice, learning, and cultivation. And skill development has been shown in literature to lead to development in self-efficacy, self-regulation, emotional regulation, and feelings of autonomy, relatedness, and competence, which again are pillars of psychological well-being. So this can take in multiple forms, right? So for example, mastery, when say a dancer experiences a greater sense of mastery of their craft, they may gain more enjoyment and flourishing, and they may also be motivated to continue with it. Similarly, they may feel reinforced when they receive direct encouragement for their artistic or humanities-related activities, and then maybe are subsequently likely to experience more flourishing outcomes. On another end, like people might also develop their skills through observation of others who engage in the same activities, so sort of like a vicarious skill development. And finally, they can also receive more positive in the moment physiological feedback that then encourages them to continue in their habit. So the third mechanism is immersion. And I think this one is a pretty well known and talked about in positive psychology as well. And the immersion mechanism represents a sort of attention captured during engagement with arts and humanities, often resulting in feeling of being carried away or also labeled as flow. So, for example, immersion in music is used often in various modes of media where it can promote kind of visual imagery, rhythmic entrainment, expectancy-related arousal, emotional contagion, and even triggering of autobiographical memories. An example of this, I think, actually is in the movie Soul. If you guys have seen it, they do a good job of kind of showing the experience of flow. And in particular, these immersive experiences can derive affective states such as awe, and when they become a state of flow, they can also lead to a greater in-the-moment sensory experience. And according to transportation theory, immersion in texts and stories can lead to greater enjoyment that then can turn into self-transformation and then influence our subsequent interaction with and judgments of the world. So building on the theoretical work on flow experience, we think one of the dimensions of immersion could be passage of time, which represents experiences when one is so immersed in an activity that you lose track of time. And then that leads to kind of like greater in the moment sensory experience. Similarly, immersion can also include experience of losing yourself in activity so much that it feels effortless. And then such absorption can also lead to better flourishing outcomes through positive psychological and physiological reactions. And at the same time, immersion can also result in lack of self-consciousness that enhances human flourishing by broadening their experience and promoting emotional depth and breadth as well. So these are the three dimensions we think that immersion could be representing. And the next we have socialization. Arts and humanities can have a social component, whether it's intended or not. Some research suggests that artistic endeavors are part of an evolutionary mechanism for creating and maintaining social ties with humans, and arts and culture can bring like variety of beliefs and perspectives to the individual, either from within the community or across different cultural environments. So through socialization, arts and humanities can enhance empathy and theory of mind, broaden cognitive and emotional experiences through novel encounters, enhance emotional repertoire, and function as an exposure to emotional episodes that then induct maybe children into emotional culture. And multiple meta-analyses have suggested that frequent readers of fiction, or like if they were experimentally motivated to read more fiction, they gained significant improvements in social cognition, including mentalizing, perspective taking, emotion identification. So we think that socialization can have different dimensions, such as relationship and conversation, where people bond with others who engage in similar activities. For example, readers form a book club, musicians perform together, or artists coalesce in exhibitions. So they converge together, they share resources and enjoyment, and subsequently they fuse their engagement in the arts and humanities with social bonding. Similarly, engagement in the arts and humanities can also influence their identity. So for example, I paint a lot, so I can identify as an artist, which can then also like function as a way to help them through social mobility. So for example, maybe if you are able to participate in more high prestige activities such as opera or art exhibits, then you're able to get better like well-being outcomes, mostly through economic social mobility. And another process through which individuals can engage in the arts and humanities could be through the sense of belonging to a group, right? So it's a little different because identification can be more like feeling part of a community, like you're part of a dance coalition, and therefore you identify with that community. And finally, we have expressiveness, and this was the mechanism we added in addition to the 4 mechanisms proposed by Tay et al. In 2018. So one crucial characteristic of engagement in the arts and humanities is that it can provide opportunity for individuals to express themselves in creative and novel ways, which can then subsequently influence their individual flourishing. For example, obviously there's been a lot of, I think, work in art therapy, talking about how expressing your emotions through art can be beneficial, but there's also been work suggesting that expressive writing can increase people's subjective well-being. So this could be another mechanism through which individuals can express themselves in an activity and then allow them to enjoy the proximal experience as well as use arts and humanities as an emotional regulation tool. And we theorize that expressiveness is a single factor construct. So we have 3 main aims with this project that I'm going to be guiding the research along with. So first is to develop and validate scales to capture the key mechanisms of engagement in the arts and humanities so that we can empirically study these mechanisms in relation to how they influence individual well-being. We also test for measurement equivalence across gender, over time, and between arts and humanities to make sure we can make meaningful comparisons across these groups or over time, and make sure that these scales are not differing in meaning, but rather we can actually make between group comparisons. And finally, we aim to examine whether these mechanisms predict different well-being outcomes concurrently or longitudinally. So starting with the scale development and validation part, basically I'm going to detail how we did item generation and reduction and present the structure of each mechanism scale and show their reliability and model fits. So for the item generation, we took a deductive approach where based on each construct and its dimensions, we created multiple items, parallel items for both arts and humanities. We ran a pilot study, or like it was study 1 that I will not be detailing due to constraints of time, but I can talk about it later if somebody is interested. But basically we use the pilot study to reduce the number of items based on their the exploratory factor analyses, looking at the structure and factor loadings. And then with the result, we added further items because some of the factors didn't load as we expected, and we further refined it. And then we ended up with 150 parallel items for study 2. So this is the study that I'm going to be talking about mostly today. So in this study, we recruited US M-Turkers and asked them questions, answer questions about the nature of their engagement in the arts and humanities. At time 1, we conducted exposure factor analyses to remove items and finalize the scales. And then we used this finalized scale at time 2 to validate the reduced scales, so using confirmatory factor analyses. So with the items, the 150 parallel items that we had at time 1 for each mechanism scale for arts and humanities separately, we removed items if greater than 2% of the participants found the items to be unclear. If they were negatively worded, this is because items that were featuring negatively worded items, they loaded as a separate factor of negative items rather than the construct that it was supposed to be intended for. So we removed those. And ones with low factor loadings, less than 0.5 or cross-loading, those were obviously removed. So we conducted this process simultaneously across arts and humanities items separately and prioritized parallel items across the two to retain similar items for each factor. So I'm going to be showing the result of the scales, like the structure of the scales based on that exposure factor analyses, and also the model fit results from study 2 or time 2. So reflectiveness emerged as a 3-dimensional construct. The external focused factor came out as theorized, and the internal focused item contained a bit more emotional items than we expected. So we relabeled as emotional self-reflection, and then life worldview was reflection about the world as theorized. So some example items, for example, this was a prompt while engaged in activities related to the arts, or if it was for humanities, while engaged in activities related to the humanities. An example item of external focused factor was, I make an effort to see the world through others' eyes, right? And one for emotional self-reflection was, I savor past experiences. And for life and worldview was, I reflect on philosophy of life. So these are some representative items for each of these factors. The reliability was pretty good, ranging from 0.95 to 0.96, depending on the time, time 1 or time 2 of the measure, and also arts and humanities. Test-retest reliability was pretty high as well, suggesting that it's semi-stable across time. And our model fit results were pretty acceptable as well, suggesting it was a good fit, mostly focusing on CFI and TLI being higher than 0.9 or 0.95 even in this case. And the second mechanism scale was regarding acquisition mechanism. So we originally theorized this was going to be a 4-dimension scale or like 4-dimension construct. We ended up with 2 more factors than theorized. So the items created for mastery, experience of mastery, split into ability and success. And similarly, direct encouragement split, some of the items from direct encouragement split from direct encouragement to social persuasion. So looking at the items, for example, direct encouragement was others praise my skills. Experience of mastery, ability again was focused on more like sort of like growth related, developing of new skills and abilities. Vicarious experience, as we mentioned before, relates to learning based on observing others. Positive physiological response, for example, is I feel at ease when I'm, engaged in the activities. Experience of mastery success is related to mastery, but more so focusing on the successful part rather than development of abilities. And social persuasion encompasses items about persuasion or support from others to continue skill development, sometimes even feedback. One representative item is I feel supported when needed. Again, their internal consistency was pretty high. The alpha, cornbox alpha ranged from 0.95 to 0.97. Test-retest reliability was pretty high as well. And the model fit was pretty decent. And now looking at immersion. Immersion emerged as a 2-dimension construct. We have time, the passage of time. For example, when engaged in the activities related to arts and humanities, I don't feel how the time passes. And effortless involvement was, more so talking about how when you're involved in an activity, continuing doesn't seem like that much effort. The loss of social consciousness did not emerge as a factor, so it was removed. And the compass alpha was a little low on this one, but semi-decent. And test-retest reliability was not too high, ranging from 0.51 to 0.54, which suggests that maybe it's not as stable as the other mechanisms. Perhaps it's a more in the moment experience, so therefore it's not prone to be consistent over time. And the model fits were okay, like again, all of the CFI and TLI were over 0.90. That was going to be our main metric. And for socialization, we ended up with 3 dimensions, but the relationships and conversations were originally theorized to be 1 factor, but they were split into 2. And identity and identification didn't emerge as separate factors, so it was just merged into identity. Some example items. Socialization had a little bit different prompt, which is my engagement in the activities related to the arts, for example, allows me to feel closer to the people in my life, directly related to relationships, develop a sense of identity, or engage in more meaningful conversations. And again, Chromebase Alpha was pretty high, and retest reliability was pretty high as well. And the model fit was pretty good. Actually, it was, I think, the best model fit of all of the mechanisms. Finally, expressiveness was just 1 dimension, 5 items. When engaged in the arts and activities related to arts or humanities, I can freely express my thoughts or emotions. That would be 1 representative example of this factor. And their Chromebase alpha was pretty high. The test-retest reliability was a little low. And again, I think the same as immersion, the mechanisms are a bit more in the moment, or maybe it's more difficult to find capture this specific experience, and they tend to have lower stability over time. But the model fit itself was really good. Again, just in conclusion for this section, across all the mechanisms, each scale had good internal consistency, test-retest reliability suggesting some stability, particularly for the 3 mechanisms, and appropriate levels for the model fit indices, and validating the scale structure. So in the next section, I'm going to be talking more about the measurement equivalence, where we present a test for psychometric equivalence of these mechanisms across arts and humanities, across gender, and over time. So this is really important to do because measurement invariance or non-equivalence suggests that a construct has different structure or meaning to different groups or across different measurement occasions for the same group. And in such case, the construct cannot be meaningfully tested or construed across groups or across time. So they can't be compared because they just mean different things for different people. We aim to show that these scales were equivalent in structure and meaning across different groups, so we can actually perform between group comparisons. Again, using the same study, we primarily use time 2 data to conduct measurement equivalence tests for gender and between arts and humanities. We then use time 1 data and time 2 data to do measurement equivalence test across time. So first, looking at measurement equivalence across arts and humanities, comparing the 2. The baseline model here is the configural, testing the configural invariance, which compares the equality in factor structures across samples. So to test for it, you fit the model you have specified to each group, and then leaving all factor loadings and item intercepts to vary freely, but the structure is the same, right? And so that's the baseline model, and you can look at their fit, and it's pretty high for all of them. And then we have more stringent tests. So the metric model is also known as like the weak invariance, which compares the equality in factor loadings between groups. So it's not just looking at the number of factors that emerge, but and what items go into which factors, but also looking at whether the loadings are equivalent across groups, right? And it still allows for item intercepts to vary freely as before. And the scalar one is the most constrictive and constricting and is known as strong invariance. It constrains the structure, the factor loadings, and item intercepts. So these tests then allow you to substantiate multi-group comparisons of factor means. So what we do is originally create a baseline model with the configural and then see whether the subsequent more restricting models are worse fit, right? So a model fit is supposed to be practically equivalent if the CFI changes is less than 0.01 according to Chung and Ransford 2002 or 0.02 based on others' findings. Again, different opinions on it, but as we can see, our studies suggest that all of them are pretty, the CFI change wasn't that high at all, suggesting that our scale has a good measurement equivalence across arts and humanities, no matter how stringent the constrictions. Similarly, we looked at it across time as well. And again, all the model fits were pretty good based on different restrictions. And the metric and scalar were not that much worse. As you can see, the difference is only in 0.001 or 0.008, suggesting that between group comparisons is pretty equivalent. And this is for measurement equivalence across time for just the arts. And here it is, measurement equivalence across time for humanities. And again, the same thing, we don't really have that much drop in CFI. We did also measurement equivalence across gender. The only one that was a little worrying was the immersion one, and we're going to do more tests on it, but everything else, they have pretty low change in CFI, suggesting that it's equivalent. And finally, measurement equivalence across gender for humanities, no problem here, even in immersion. Therefore, these are considered to be equivalent. So, I think based on these results, we can conclude that there is no significant differences in scale properties between arts and humanities across gender, across time for multiple of these, for I guess 99% of these scales in different levels of like group comparisons and on time comparisons as well, suggesting that we can make between group comparisons meaningfully. And finally, I'm going to talk about the concurrent and longitudinal predictive validity of these mechanisms in measuring well-being outcomes, particularly looking at well-being, the straightforward well-being outcomes, but also some social outcomes, work-related well-being, and affect. Again, we're using the same study, but the concurrent validity and relative weights analyses was conducted using the sample at time 2, and predictive validity used scale measurements from time 1 to predict outcome variables at time 2. So these are the outcome measures that we looked at, 9 measures spanning different aspects of human flourishing and experience. We have, the standard comprehensive inventory of thriving, but also meaning in life, civic engagement, curiosity exploration, IRA interpersonal reactivity index, mostly just the perspective taking and empathy items, and work-life balance and job satisfaction, more related to the work context well-being, and also positive and negative affect. So from this correlation table, you can tell that these mechanisms were pretty good predictors of these different outcome variables. The correlation, the R1 represents concurrent validity, and this one is longitudinal. R2 is longitudinal. And the only notable exclusions were, the only notable exclusions where immersion in arts was not a significant predictor of civic engagement in terms of longitudinal validity, and immersion and expressiveness in humanities was not for IRI, but only in context of humanities. Looking at work-related well-being and emotion like affect, we don't find as consistent prediction in this regard, particularly immersion with work-life balance in prediction, long-term prediction, and in job satisfaction, in sort of concurrent correlation. But the one that was least predicted was negative affect. Only expressiveness and acquisition in arts were significant predictors of negative affect. So what part of the reason for this significance could be because of the dimension positive physiological response in acquisition that may have more direct relationship with negative affect. And when we looked at these correlations inside the factors within dimensions, that was the significant one. So this one's to be expected. We also did relative importance analysis, so relative weights analyses to look at which were the most important predictors for each of these outcomes when comparing these mechanisms within, say, the arts and the humanities. And R squared, obviously here to show variance explained by these different mechanisms. So first, reflectiveness was the most important predictor of civic engagement and interpersonal reactivity index, which again, as we mentioned, includes perspective taking and empathy, which is quite interesting actually. And acquisition was the most important mechanism actually for a lot of these outcomes, including comprehensive inventory of thriving, work-life balance, as well as job satisfaction and positive affect. Acquisition in the arts was also the most important predictor for negative affect, but not humanities. Sorry?
Sorry, just to quickly jump in here, could you explain the numbers, what they mean?
Oh, so each of these are sort of like variable weights to see which one is the most important. So for example, the higher number, like 30, means it's the most important variable to explain this variance.
Yeah, so they should all add up to 100, right?
Yeah. So it's like percentage of variance explained.
Okay, just want to make sure that
yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for the question, actually. Yeah, I hope that helps somebody else as well. Yeah, so as I was mentioning, acquisition was the most important mechanism for a number of these outcomes, and particularly and acquisition in arts was important for negative affect, but not so much in humanities. But again, I do want to be careful about any conclusions here because the variance explained in negative affect was pretty low by these mechanisms, suggesting that maybe they don't really influence it as much or are correlated with it as much. And immersion was not the most important predictor for any of these outcomes, unfortunately. A little bit high in interpersonal reactivity index, but not really compared to the rest. And socialization was the most important predictor for meaning in life, but not by much, but it was competing with acquisition quite a bit, but it was found to be the most important. And expressiveness in arts and humanities most strongly predicted curiosity exploration, so 35, 31 here, suggesting that it's pretty important for that outcome. And expressiveness in humanities was also the most important predictor for negative affect. But again, the variance in R square was 0.02, so it's the conclusions are a little bit far-fetched in that. So all in all, the mechanisms were good predictors of well-being outcomes. They had significant correlations with all of them, concurrently and longitudinally, not all, but majority of them. Specific findings that were interesting was that reflectiveness was most important for civic thoughts and activities. along with interpersonal reactivity, perspective taking, and empathy, which is really fascinating. Acquisition was the most important mechanism for CIT, work-life balance, job satisfaction, and positive affect. And socialization was the most important predictor for meaning in life, and expressiveness most strongly predicted curiosity exploration. So just to sum it up, all that we've discussed in this talk, for aim 1, we have the following findings. We were able to validate the RAISE scale such that they were internally consistent, had good test-retest reliability and proper model fits. I think this scale can be really useful for future empirical work that seeks to understand how engagement in the arts and humanities leads to well-being through each of these 5 mechanisms, and more work in the future can also look at their specific dimensions and how that can differentially predict your well-being outcomes. And for aim 2 findings, we did conduct a test of measurement equivalence across groups and times, and found that they do not differ in properties across gender, across arts and humanities, and over time. And therefore, these scales can be used to make meaningful between group comparisons for the future. And finally, we looked at whether these scales predicted most of well-being outcomes, and we found that they did concurrently and longitudinally. In future research, I think we can evaluate how each mechanism and its dimensions can have differential effects on individual experiences beyond just well-being. Speaking of future investigations, you can actually take the survey yourself and receive feedback from the Humanities and Human Flourishing website. We have the toolkit up there. Still, IRB is pending, so we won't be able to use your research, but at the same time, you can take it yourself and actually measure across time how your engagement changes in arts and humanities, and see maybe how that relates to your well-being as well. Again, many thanks to my collaborators again and the DRT for funding this project. Thank you for your attention. I would welcome any questions you have at this point.
How do we get recognized for
By
this?
speaking. Go for it,
Okay.
Paul.
Okay. Hi. I thought this was, first of all, very thorough, very important thing to get involved in. I have a couple of questions. One of them is, it seems to me to make this a full measure, you would want to get the predictors of the scores that you get on this. And it seems to me a major predictor is whether you perform or are an audience. That is, by performing something in the arts, you have a very different kind of relationship to them than now in some areas like music, for example. A lot of people do that. In other areas, and by the way, I always point out cuisine is an art. And a lot of people do creative cooking, but other people, very few people do visual art, for example. But so it seems to me that whether you perform is going to make a big difference in your relationship and how the art affects you. And the second is what the art is. So for example, theater, either as a performer or as an audience, gets you involved in another person's life, as does fiction. And that's going to really affect your perspective taking. Whereas playing in the oboe is not going to do much of that. It's a very internal sort of thing. It's, abstract music mostly. So what I'm thinking is that you might want to know how much things like how much you perform in art, what arts do you engage in your life, what humanities. That might be a very good predictor of your endpoints without the scale. I don't know, but I'm just saying that one of the biggest issues is how much is arts part of your life and how much is it an active part of your life? And I think that's really fundamental. So I have one of my sons is a theater director and a playwright, and his life is about this. Another son is a music theorist who teaches music theory, but he's very involved in music. So they have different relations to the arts, and other people have almost no relationship to the arts. So they could still answer these questions because they watch television and so on. But I think that's a real pre-predictor of what you're doing. In other words, you get a survey of people's involvement with the arts. You look how it affects your scale, and you also look at how it affects the endpoints, the well-being and so on.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And honestly, this work that I'm presenting is part of like a bigger approach to do all of that. And so Lewis can talk more about it. But you know, in the conceptual model that they originally theorized, they had modes of engagement. So like, you know, how do you create, or do you like participate? Do you teach? And or go to events or collect, etc. So we have different dimensions based on that can then the future work that we have with this finalized scale is to draw that
Sure.
that path, right?
Well,
and sorry.
Oh, good. But I want to apologize. My picture wasn't on when I started because there's a little gimmick on my computer that closes the thing that I just fixed. But pardon me for that. No, I think, look, you can't do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And you've done a really thorough job on one piece of this, for which I congratulate. I'm just pointing out that there's a major determinants of what you're measuring that are important.
Yeah. I think that's a really great point. And I think future research with this scale, hopefully with the scale being validated, is that we can conduct those experiments in the future and get all this data on, like, you know, what kind of activities you're doing, or like, you know, the modes of engagement, etc. And then see whether different mechanisms are differentially important based on what kind of arts and humanities activities you do, but also like modes of engagement. So I think that's a really great point. And I think that's definitely something that we should do in the future with this.
Do you, by the way, do you define the arts or the humanities for your subject? So I'm thinking being a sports fan probably doesn't count, but it is very much participatory. It's identification with others. I'm just wondering, there's a lot of openness here, and I'm wondering how your subjects take the words arts and humanities.
That's a good point. I don't think we did explain like what arts or humanities. We assumed they would know that it, you know, whether if they are engaged in certain activities that they can.
Okay.
But that's a really great. It might actually have effects on how people interpret their meanings of like these engagements, but also like meanings of the scale items and everything too. So that's a great point. I think would be worthwhile to investigate. Sure.
Yeah, just to add to what Stuti is saying, thanks, Paul, for your great insights there. Yeah, we wanted to leave it fairly open-ended because, like what you said, some people might think of cuisine as an art. So we provided a list of some potentially typical types of, you know, artistic activities, but then we didn't want to close it off either. So when we kind of gave the prompt about arts or humanities engagement, we wanted to leave it fairly open-ended, and we focus on the types of you know, psychological mechanisms that are evoked as they kind of engage in that.
If I can chime in too, yeah, great questions, Paul, and very much connected to directions in which we are going or want to go. Just a quick point about the second one around sports. So one of our questions is, you know, is there anything about arts and humanities engagement that is uniquely separate from something like sports, for example? So in a current study that we're doing that Damien Crone is spearheading, we've got a group that we're looking at specifically to see what their report is on arts and humanities engagement. And we're asking the same questions of a group that we're asking to reflect on their experience with sports. So we want to see, is it just, you know, the same kind of experience, but a different kind of, or is there something about the arts and humanities that separated out from sports was about as active a control as we could think of to arts and humanities? And then to your first question, totally agree. Again, it's a great point. And one of the next directions that we want to go with the work that Damien is spearheading, initially, we've looked across a representative sample to get their reports on engagement with arts and culture. We're looking specifically to connections between, or differences between, kind of one-time epiphanic experiences versus ongoing practices. And we've started with the general representative sample, and a next step that we want to take now is to look to specialized audiences to see whether people who are specifically working in music, for example, or people who are specifically music professionals. So we may be hitting up your children for some responses to our essays or to our questions. But yeah, very much simpatico with the direction that you were suggesting.
I wanted to add, I completely agree with the sort of audience versus performer question and a lot of what other folks have been said, I should say. So I work for the center, but my training is in, I have a PhD in dance and performance studies. And so that's what my training is. And I'm also a practicing dance artist and performer. And I'm not entirely sure I can tell you or have words for why, but I'm sort of intuitively not surprised that expressiveness and immersion were sort of, there was some instability there. I think that the question of expressiveness, there's the like, what exactly are we expressing? That I think is like, is a huge question for artists and practitioners in general. And certainly over the course of the 20th and 21st century, the sort of experimental arts have really been sort of focused around actually what is the art form and what are the boundaries of my art form. So like when we're talking about dance, like how do we define, like my field is very much like steeped in how do we actually define what is a performance? like basically that's the whole field, is what is a performance? And what is a dance? And the practice, sort of the practices and the experimental practices are like, well, you know, there's a group of dancers in the 60s in New York, the sort of who performed at Judson Church, and they were doing all kinds of experiments that involved sort of coming into the space and eating a sandwich and then leaving the space and being like, that's my dance. So yeah, there's that. I think that issue of expressiveness for me intuitively seems like it's not surprising. Then the other kind of comment I have that is on a different side, and when I think about negative affect, is I'm wondering, like, so were all of your respondents US based? So I'm wondering what variable, what we might see when we like look at populations where arts is much better funded. Mm-hmm. And the different kinds of results you're going to get. And is this a tool we can potentially use to maybe get better funding for arts? I'll stop there.
Well, if I can just chime in, Laura, it's great to meet you. I look forward to further conversations. I had no idea you had that background, which is phenomenal. And really helpful insights. Hopefully, again, we can follow up. And to your last point, yes, that's definitely part of what we're hoping for with the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project in general, is to work collaboratively to develop scientific processes, measures, and to have a greater sense of the various mechanisms involved. Can we have a greater confidence about both knowing when certain activities, events increase human flourishing, and how and what aspects of them we can focus on to increase that flourishing, and then be able to take that information out to organizations like performing arts centers or museums, universities, and also to have an influence on policy. So very much in our trajectory.
Hey, Stuti.
Oh yeah, just to add on it.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on, yeah.
No, go ahead. I'll ask after.
Okay, so thank you. Oh, just to add on that comment, we are planning to like translate and study these mechanisms in South Korea. So trying to do a lot of like cross-cultural study too, and perhaps might be tied to the funding component that you were mentioning, Laura. But it would be really interesting to find any like cultural differences in that regard. Sorry, go Alex.
I just wanted to echo what others have said. Just a very thorough job of this validation, which I love to see. So great job with that. I did have just one kind of statistical methodological question just in regards to, you had some factors that kind of split or came out into like two factors, maybe where you were expecting one. And I was wondering with that if you had checked for like correlated residuals, or maybe that these were like minor factors coming out, because your convex alphas were definitely very high, which suggests to me that maybe there could be like some semantic overlap, or just in the wording of the questions that were, for example, like the one that I wrote down, like the experience of mastery, if some were, if questions within kind of those two factors that came out were just so similar to each other that they came out as two rather than the expected single factor there.
Oh, that's a really interesting point, and I would love to get any recommendations you have about doing the correlated residuals that you were mentioning. Looking at the items themselves, they were pretty distinctly two different factors. They were like very evenly split, and factor loadings also didn't have any like cause for concern, because they were all really highly loaded, like 0.7 and up for each of these different factors. So they were very cleanly separated, both conceptually looking at the items themselves and also loading. So we didn't really do any additional changes to it. And again, some of them could be because in the start of the second study, we really increased the number of items. We had a lot, like 150. And when we cut down, I think we were able to get like really clean separations in terms of factors that we didn't even expect. So a lot of them were not as unexpected as we thought, just they were a little bit split. But yeah, but that's like a really good point. I would love to get any like resources on that just to verify even more.
No, absolutely. I think the high factor loadings is a good sign, and suggests and that I just want to clarify, the high factor loadings were for those splitting factors as well, so they were loaded.
So for all of them, I think we would maybe one item that was like close to 0.6, but everything was over 0.7. So right. It was really, it would seem very clean cut.
Cool, thank you.
Oh, Vera, did you want to say something? No, you were leaning into your computer, and I thought you were going to speak, and I didn't want to cut you off.
Oh, sorry, and I just wrote something in the chat, but no.
Okay.
Thank you. It's okay. A very fascinating, yeah. No, I mean, actually, I was interested how you came up with the original items. Maybe you mentioned that and I missed it, but so did you kind of write them up based on the theory?
So just a detail, the original, so before pilot one, like the study one, we had like 80 items created by 3 researchers based on the construct and its dimensions. So we just created like a bunch of those items based on that. And then after we did the pilot study, we looked at resulting factors and whether there were some that we expected to have and they didn't emerge. So we really loaded up more items based on the dimensions and trying to get like a full encompassing kind of items for all of the constructs. So that's what we did. It was deductively generated,
Okay, great, thank you.
Terrific, and that takes us to the end of our time. Thanks to all of you who joined us. Please be in touch. Great ideas, suggestions, comments. As things continue to percolate, we would love to hear your ideas, because this is very much the beginning of this work. And so we really want to continue it in ways that will be optimally successful, both in terms of the research and in terms of the value that the research can add into our world. So thanks again. Please join me in thanking Stuti again for terrific work and a great presentation. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.